Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden and revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Hating the very sound of Leo because of the treason of Laos. If this was Greek, you could probably put an N and then PS or something at the end of that too, depending on the context. Theseus, longing to be in action, and desirous also to make himself popular, left Athens to fight with the bull of Marathon, which did no small mischief to the inhabitants of Tetrapolis, and having overcome it, he brought it alive in triumph through the city, and afterwards sacrificed it to the Delphinian oracle. The story of Hecale also, of her receiving and entertaining Theseus in this expedition, seems to be not altogether void of truth, for the townships round about, meeting upon a certain day, used to offer a sacrifice, which they called Hecalesia, to Jupiter, Hecalesius, and to pay honor to Hecale, whom by a diminutive name they called Hecaline, because she, while entertaining Theseus, who was quite a youth, addressed him, as old people do, with similar endearing diminutives, and having made a vow to Jupiter for him as he was going to the fight, that if he returned in safety, she would offer sacrifices in thanks of it, and dying before he came back, she had these honors given her by way of return for her hospitality, by the command of Theseus, as Philochorus tells us. Not long after arrived the third time from Crete the collectors of the tribute which the Athenians paid them upon the following occasion. Androgeus, having been treacherously murdered in the confines of Attica, not only Minos, his father, put the Athenians to extreme distress by a perpetual war, but the entities they thought gods also laid waste to their country. Both famine and pestilence lay heavy upon them, and even their rivers were dried up, being told by the oracle that if they appeased and reconciled Minos, the anger of these entities would cease, and they should enjoy rest from the miseries they labored under. They sent heralds, and with much supplication were at last reconciled, entering into an agreement to send to Crete every 9 years a tribute of 7 young men and as many virgins as most writers agree in stating. And the most poetical story adds that the Minotaur destroyed them, are that, wandering into the labyrinth and finding no possible means of getting out, they miserably ended their lives there. And that this Minotaur was, as Euripides hath it, a mingled form, where 2 strange shapes combined, and different natures, bull and man, were joined. And no matter how hard things are, don't commit suicide. If anything, that gives people who don't deserve it a success in causing your destruction. But Philochorus says that the Cretans will by no means allow the truth of this, but say that the labyrinth was only an ordinary prison, having no other bad quality, but it secured the prisoners from escaping, and that Minos, having instituted games in honor of Androgeus, gave, as a reward to the victors, these youths, who in the meantime were kept in the labyrinth, and that the first that overcame in those games was one of the greatest power and command among them, named Taurus, a man of no merciful or gentle disposition, who treated the Athenians that were made his prize in a proud and cruel manner. Also Aristotle himself, in the account that he gives of the form of government of the Bactrians is manifestly of opinion that the youths were not slain by Minos, but spent the remainder of their days in slavery in Crete, that the Cretans in former times, to acquit themselves of an ancient vow which they had made, were used to send an offering of the first fruits of their men to Delphi, and that some descendants of these Athenian slaves were mingled with them and sent amongst them, and unable to get their living there, removed from thence, first into Italy, and settled about Japugia, but the J doesn't sound right. Iapugia, or something. From hence, then, again, they removed to Thrace, and renamed Bactrians, and that this is the reason why, in a certain sacrifice, the Bactrian girls sing a hymn, beginning, "Let us go to Athens." This may show how dangerous it is to incur the hostility of a city that is mistress of eloquence and song, for Minos was always ill spoken of, and represented ever as a very wicked man in the Athenian theatres. Neither did Hesiod avail him by calling him the most royal Minos, nor Homer, who styles him Jupiter's familiar friend. The tragedians got the better, and from the vantage ground of the stage showered down obloquy upon him as a man of cruelty and violence, whereas, in fact, he appears to have been a king and a lawgiver, and Rhadamanthus a judge under him, administering the statutes that he ordained. Now when the time of the third tribute was come, and the fathers who had any young men for their sons were to proceed by a lot of the choice of those that were to be sent, there arose fresh discontents and accusations against Agius among the people, who were full of grief and indignation, that he who was the cause of all their miseries was the only person exempt from the punishment, adopting and settling his kingdom upon a bastard and foreign son. He took no thought, they said, of their destitution and lost, not of bastards, but lawful children. These things sensibly affected Theseus, who, thinking it but just not to disregard, but rather partake of, the sufferings of his fellow citizens, offered himself for one without any lot. Now, it's sort of a phrase, the sufferings of the fellow, because suffering is not quite the same thing as difficulty. People use the word so much that you cause suffering, or, but suffering is the judgments that make things worse. All else were struck with admiration for the nobleness, and with love for the goodness of the act, and Agius, after prayers and entreaties, finding him inflexible, and not to be persuaded, proceeding to the choosing of the rest by lot. Hellenicus, however, tells us that the Athenians did not send the young men and virgins by lot, but that Minos himself used to come and make his own choice, and pitched upon Theseus before all others, according to the conditions agreed upon between them, namely, that the Athenians should furnish them with a ship, and that the young men were to sail with him, should carry no weapons of war, but that, if the Minotaur was destroyed, the tribute should cease. On 2 former occasions of the payment, the tribute entertaining no hopes of safety or return, they sent out the ship with a black sail, as to unavoidable destruction. But now Theseus, encouraging his father, and speaking greatly of himself, as confident that he should kill the Minotaur, he gave the pilot another sail, which was white, commanding him, as he returned, if Theseus were safe, to make use of that, but if not, to sail with the black one, and to hang out that sign of his misfortune. Simonides says that the sail which Agius delivered to the pilot was not white, but scarlet in the juicy bloom of the living oak tree steeped, and that this was to be the sign of their escape. Pheroclos, son of Marsyas, according to Simonides, was pilot of the ship, But Philochorus says that Theseus had sent him by Scyros from Salamis, now Ithous, to be his steersman, and Phaax to his lookout man in the prow, the Athenians having as yet not applied themselves to navigation, and that Scyros did this because one of the young men, Menesthes, was his daughter's son, and this the chapels of Nausithous and Phaax, built by Theseus near the temple of Scyros, confirm. He adds also that the feast named Cybernesia was in honor of them, the lot being cast, and Theseus having received out of the Prietaneum those upon whom it fell, he went to the Delphinium and made an offering for them to Apollo of his suppliant's badge, which was a bough of a consecrated olive tree, with white wool tied about it. Having thus performed his devotion, he went to sea the 6th day of Munyakion, on which day, even to this time, the Athenians sent their virgins to the same temple to make supplication to those they considered to be gods. It is further reported that he was commanded by the oracle of Delphi to make Venus his guide and to invoke her as the companion and conductress of his voyage, and that, as he was sacrificing a she-goat to her by the seaside, it was suddenly changed into a he, and for this cause that female entity had the name of Epitragia. When he arrived at Crete, as most of the ancient historians, as well as poets tell us, having a clue of thread given him by Ariadne, who had fallen in love with him, and being instructed by her how to use it as so to conduct him through the windings of the labyrinth, he escaped out of it and slew the Minotaur, and sailed back, taking along with him Ariadne and the young Athenian captives. Pharcides adds that he bored holes in the bottom of the Cretan ships to hinder their pursuit. Damon writes that Taurus, the chief captain of Minos, was slain by Theseus at the mouth of the port in a naval combat as he was sailing out for Athens. But Philochorus gives us the story thus, that at the setting forth of the yearly games by King Minos, Taurus was expected to carry away the prize, and as he had done before, and was much grudged the honor, his character and manners made his power hateful, and he was accused, moreover, of too near familiarity with Pasiphae, for which reason, when Theseus declared the combat, Minos readily complied, and it was a custom in Crete that the women also should be admitted to the sight of these games. Ariadne, being present, was struck with admiration of the manly beauty of Theseus, and the vigor and address which he showed in the combat, overcoming all that encountered with him. Minos, too, being extremely pleased with him, especially because he had overthrown and disgraced Taurus, voluntarily gave up the young captives to Theseus, and remitted the tribute to the Athenians. Clidamus gives an account peculiar to himself, very ambitiously, and beginning a great way back, that it was a decree consented to all by Greece, that no vessel from any place containing above 5 persons should be permitted to sail, Jason only excepted, who was made captain of the ship Argo, to sail about and scour the sea of pirates. But Daedalus, having escaped from Crete and flying by sea to Athens, Minos, contrary to this decree, pursued him with his ships of war and was forced by a storm upon Sicily, and there ended his life. After his decease, Deucalion, his son, desiring a quarrel with the Athenians, sent to them, demanding that they should deliver up Daedalus to him, threatening upon their refusal to put to death all the young Athenians whom his father had received as hostages from the city. To this angry message Theseus returned a very gentle answer, excusing himself that he could not deliver up Daedalus, who was nearly related to him, being his cousin german, his mother being Merope, the daughter of Erechtheus. In the meanwhile, he secretly prepared a navy, part of it at home near the village of Themoetada, a place of no resort, and far from any common roads, the other part by his grandfather Pittheus's means at Troezen, that so his design might be carried on with the greatest secrecy. As soon as ever his fleet was in readiness, he set sail, having with him Daedalus and other exiles from Crete for his guides, and none of the Cretans having any knowledge of his coming, but imagining, when they saw his fleet, that they were friends and vessels of their own. He soon made himself master of the port, and immediately, making a descent, reached Cnossus before any notice of his coming, and in the battle before the gates of the labyrinth put Deucalion and all his guards to the sword. The government, by this means, falling to Ariadne, he made a league with her, and received the countess of her, and ratified a perpetual friendship between the Athenians and the Cretans, whom he engaged under an oath never again to commence any war with Athens. There are yet many other traditions about these things, and as many concerning Ariadne, all inconsistent with each other. Some relate that she hung herself, being deserted by Theseus; others, that she was carried away by his sailors to the isle of Naxos, and married to Oanares, priest of Bacchus, and that Theseus left her because he fell in love with another. For Agril's love was burning in his breast. A verse which Hiraz, the Megarian, says was formerly in the poet Hesiod's works, but he put out by Pisistratus, in like manner as he added in Homer's raising of the dead, to gratify the Athenians, the line, Theseus, Pirithous, mighty sons of entities. Others say that Ariadne had sons by Theseus, Ionapion, and Stephalus, and among these is the poet Ion of Chios, who writes of his own native city, which once Oenopion, son of Theseus, built. But the more famous of the legendary stories, everybody, as I may say, has in his mouth. In Paon, however, the Amathusian, there is a story given differing from the rest, for he writes that Theseus, being driven by a storm upon the isle of Cyprus, and having aboard with him Ariadne, big with child, and extremely discomposed with the rolling of the sea, set her on shore, and left her there alone to return himself and help the ship, when, on a sudden, a violent wind carried him again out to sea, that the women of the island received Ariadne very kindly, and did all they could to console and alleviate her distress at being left behind, that they counterfeited kind letters and delivered them to her, as sent from Theseus, and, when she fell in labor, were diligent in performing to her every needful service, but that she died before she could be delivered, and was honorably interred, that soon after Theseus returned, and was greatly afflicted for her loss, and at his departure left a sum of money among the people of the island, ordering them to do sacrifice to Ariadne, and caused 2 little images to be made and dedicated to her, one of the silver and the other of brass. Moreover, that on the 2nd day of Gorpiaus, which is sacred to Ariadne, they have this ceremony among their sacrifices, to have a youth lie down, and with his voice and gesture represent the pains of a woman in travail, and that the Amathusians call the grove which they show her tomb the grove of Venus Ariadne. Differing yet from this account, some of the Naxians write that there were 2 Menosis and 2 Ariadnes, one of whom, they say, was married to Bacchus in the isle of Naxos, and bore the children of Staphylos and his brother, but that the other of a later age was carried off by Theseus, and being afterwards deserted by him, retired to Naxos with her nurse, Carcina, whose grave they yet show. That this Ariadne also died there, and was worshipped by the island, but in a different manner from the former, for her day is celebrated with general joy and revelling, but all the sacrifices performed to the latter are attended with mourning and gloom. Now Theseus, in his return from Crete, put in at Delos, and having sacrificed to the god of the island, dedicated the temple of the image of Venus, which Ariadne had given him, and danced with the young Athenians a dance, in memory of him, they say is still preserved among the inhabitants of Delos, consisting in certain measured turnings and returnings, imitative of the windings and twistings of the labyrinth. This dance, as Dicaarchus writes, is called among the Delians the crane. This he danced around the Caratonian altar, so called from its consisting of horns taken from the left side of the head. They say also that he instituted games in Delos, where he was This he danced around the Caratonian altar, so called from its consisting of horns taken from the left side of the head. They say also that he instituted games in Delos, where he was the first that began the custom of giving a palm to the victors. When they were come near the coast of Attica, so great was the joy for the happy success of their voyage, that neither Theseus himself nor the pilot remembered to hang out the sail, which should have been the token of their safety, to Augeas, who, in despair at the sight, threw himself headlong from a rock, and perished in the sea. But Theseus, being arrived at the port of Phalerum, paid there the sacrifices which he had vowed to the entities at his setting out to sea, and sent a herald to the city. The news of his safe return. At his entrance, the herald found the people, for the most part, full of grief for the loss of their king, others, as may well be believed, as full of joy for the tidings that he brought, and eager to welcome him, and crown him with the garlands for their good news, which he indeed accepted of, but hung them upon his herald's staff, and thus returning to the seaside before Theseus had finished his libation to the entities, he stayed apart for fear of disturbing the holy rites, but as soon as the libation was ended, went up and related the king's death, upon the hearing of which, with great lamentations and a confused tumult of grief, they ran with all haste to the city. And from thence, they say, it comes that at this day, in the feast of Oscophoria, the herald is not crowned, but his staff, and all who are present at the libation cry out, Eladiu, Iu, Iu, the first of which confused sounds is commonly used by men in haste or at a triumph. The other is proper to people in consternation or disorder of mind. Theseus, after the funeral of his father, paid his vows to Apollo the 7th day of Pianepsion, for on that day the youth that returned with him safe from Crete made their entry into the city. They say also that the custom of boiling pulse at this feast is derived from hence, because the young men that escaped put all that was left of their provision together, and boiling it in one common pot, feasted themselves with it, and ate it all up together. Hence also they carry in procession an olive branch bound about with wool, such as they made use of in their supplications, which they call arasion, crowned with all sorts of fruits, to signify that scarcity and barrenness was ceased, singing in their procession this song: Aresione, bring figs, and Aresione, bring loaves. Bring us honey, in pints and oil to rub on our bodies, and a strong flagon of wine, for all to go mellow to bed on. Although some hold opinion that this ceremony is retained in memory of the Heraclida, who were thus entertained and brought up by the Athenians, but most are of the opinion which we have given above. The ship wherein Theseus and the youth of Athens returned had 30 oars, and was preserved by the Athenians down even to the time of Demetrius Valerius, for they took away the old planks as they decayed, putting in new and stronger timber in their place, insomuch that this ship became a standing example among the philosophers for the logical question of things that grow, one side holding that the ship remained the same, and the other contending that it was not the same. The feast called Ascophoria, or the Feast of Boughs, which to this day the Athenians celebrate, was then first instituted by Theseus, for he took not with him the full number of virgins which by lot were to be carried away, but selected 2 youths of his acquaintance, of fair and womanish faces, but of a manly and forward spirit, and having by frequent baths, and avoiding the heat and scorching of the sun, with the constant use of all the ointments and washes and dresses that serve to the adorning of the head, are smoothing the skin, are improving the complexion, in a manner change them from what they were before, and having taught them farther to counterfeit the very voice and carriage and gait of virgins, so that there could not be the least difference perceived, he, undiscovered by any, put them into the number of the Athenian maids designed for Crete. At his return, he and these 2 youths led up a solemn procession in the same habit that is now worn by those who carry the vine branches. Those branches they carry in honor of Bacchus and Ariadne for the sake of their story before related, or rather because they happen to return in autumn, the time of gathering the grapes. The women who they call Dipnophera are supper carriers, are taken into these ceremonies, and assist at the sacrifice in remembrance and imitation of the mothers of the young men and virgins upon whom the lot fell, for thus they ran about bringing bread and meat to their children, and because the women then told their sons and daughters many tales and stories to comfort and encourage them under the danger they were going upon, it has still continued a custom that at this feast old fables and tales should be told. For these peculiarities we are indebted to the history of Damon. There was then a place chosen out, and a temple erected in it to Theseus, and those families out of whom the tribute of the youth was gathered were appointed to pay tax to the temple for sacrifices to him, and the house of the Phytalida had the overseeing of these sacrifices, Theseus doing them that honor in recompense of their former hospitality. Now after the death of his father Achilles, forming in his mind a great and wonderful design, he gathered together all inhabitants of Attica into one town, and made them one people of one city, whereas before they lived dispersed, and were not easy to assemble upon any affair for the common interest. Nay, differences and even wars occurred between them, which he had by his persuasions appeased, going from township to township, and from tribe to tribe, and those of a more private and mean condition readily embracing such good advice. To those of greater power he promised a commonwealth without monarchy, a democracy or people's government, in which he should only be continued as their commander in war, and the protector of their laws, all things else being equally distributed among them, and by this means brought a part of them over to his proposal. The rest, fearing his power, which was already grown very formidable, and knowing his courage and resolution, chose rather to be persuaded rather than forced into a compliance. He then dissolved all the distinct state houses, council halls, and magistracies, and built one common state house and council hall on the site of the present upper town, and gave the name of Athens to the whole state, ordaining a common feast and sacrifice, which he called Panathenea, or the sacrifice of all the united Athenians. He instituted also another sacrifice called Metoakia, or the Feast of Migration, which is yet celebrated on the 16th day of Hecatombaan. Then, as he had promised, he laid down his regal power and proceeded to order a commonwealth, entering upon this great work not without advice from entities. For having sent to council the oracle of Delphi concerning the fortune of his new government and city, he received this answer: Son of the Pythian maid, to your town and terms and fates my father gives of many states. Be not anxious nor afraid, the bladder will not fail to swim on the waves that compass him. Which oracle, they say, one of the Sibyls long after did, in a manner, repeat to the Athenians in this verse: the bladder may be dipped, but not be drowned. Now, one of the things that's, there's a difference between a Sibyl and a Cassandra. They're both sort of oracles, but a Sibyl uses an oracle rather than just being the oracle of spiritual authority claiming on anything. But this idea of, rather than competing dynasties, you're working with, a state house. It's a state house regardless of, because the center of rule in much of history has been moving back and forth and been about the individuals and their thing rather than the movement as a whole. And I'm going to leave this off here.